Hey guys, hey, welcome to Social Studies 30 review show. We got Matthew Gurst,
Thank you for having me.
struggling social studies student. He's asking some questions. Unit 4. All right, Matthew, floor's
Thank
yours.
you. Thank you for helping our brother out. My first question is, what does it mean to be a citizen?
Yeah, so what does it mean to be a citizen? Essentially, citizenship is membership in a group. And so, anytime you're part of a community, you're a citizen, and there's different understandings of citizenship. So, for example, naturalization is what I went through with my family, and essentially is when you adopt citizenship and you apply for it. There's jus soli, which is the idea of you are a citizen based on where you were born, and so jus soli, soil, place, child of the soil. There's jus sanguinis, which is where your parents are from. And so, if your parents are from a certain country, you are citizen because of your parents' blood. So you're Spanish, Portuguese, and Ecuadorian. So jus sanguinis is you are Ecuadorian and Portuguese because that's where your parents are from. And jus matrimony is essentially you are a citizen of where your spouse is from. So you marry an American man, American woman, you will become American. And so there's different understandings of citizenship. Essentially, it's just being part of a group. And with citizenship, there's rights. And so rights are things that the government protects that you can do. And so things like the right to speech and so on. But there's also responsibilities, things that we do. So like taxes and voting. And voting is a little bit different because it's both a right and a responsibility. And so there's that social contract between us and the state, and that's civil republican citizenship.
And what is citizen advocacy?
So citizen advocacy, essentially, it's when citizens participate in the political process, and so things like protest, demonstrations, is when they speak out and they challenge the systems that are in place. And so, like Black Lives Matter protest, that's an example of citizen advocacy.
Is it liberal?
Oh yeah, it's definitely liberal because you're practicing individual rights and freedoms. And so you think of Locke and Montesquieu and Rousseau and all those thinkers who say people should think for themselves and challenge the systems that exist. That's definitely a very liberal idea.
Could you tell me about the Orange Revolution?
Yeah, the Orange Revolution. So essentially, what happened is in 2004 there was a protest in Ukraine, and so what happened was the front runner Yushchenko, essentially the people thought he won, but there was a lot of fraud and election mishaps. And so what the people did was they challenged that, and they participated in something called civil disobedience, sit-ins, demonstrations, and so on, until a democracy was actually brought into play. And so that's a great example of citizen advocacy because people said, we think that something wrong was done, and they challenged the government until a new election was brought about.
Can you explain apathy to me?
You mean apartheid? Apartheid. Apartheid is essentially this policy in South Africa of strict racial segregation that occurred from the 1948 to 1994. And so essentially what happened was you got society broken up into groups, whites, colors, blacks. And so eventually people started to question this and rise up against it. And we see groups like the ANC, which was Mandela's party. And there was civil disobedience. There was actually violence. So there was actually violence in South Africa that occurred. And so there was a lot of pressure both inside the country and outside the country, which was created and stoked, which led to the end of the apartheid movement.
Got it. What was the deal with the Vietnam War?
So the Vietnam War essentially was part of the U.S. policy of containment, in which they believed that they had to go to Vietnam to stop the spread of communism. And so this ties in with the policy of containment we see during the Cold War. And at that time in America, there was this thing called McCarthyism. And so McCarthyism is this irrational fear of communists. And so it's part of this second Red Scare. The first Red Scare was in 1917 when the Soviet state was born. And so in America, there's this overwhelming fear of communists everywhere. And so we get McCarthyism, which ties into containment. And America goes to Vietnam. And this is the first war that's actually seen in real time. The media is showing what's going on, and people are speaking out against it. We get Muhammad Ali, Dr. King, all these people challenging this war, and we get protests and demonstration. And that citizen advocacy bit comes up again.
And who's that dude, Lyndon B. Johnson?
Yeah, Lyndon B. Johnson, LBJ. So he was the president in the 60s. And so he was a modern liberal, a Democrat, and he believed in the war on poverty and the war on racial injustice. And he wanted to create a great society where everyone was equal. However, the Vietnam War comes up during his administration and basically dismantles it. And we're going to see next week that he had a quite interesting relationship with Dr. King because Dr. King wanted equal voting for black people, and Lyndon Johnson, though he was a modern liberal, was not actually that progressive.
Got it. And what is the Red Scare?
Well, the Red Scare I just talked about essentially is this fear that communism is going to come to America's shores, and so that it starts in the Soviet Union, but it will spread. And so there was actually two Red Scares. The first Red Scare was in 1917 during the Russian Revolution, and later on in the 50s and 60s with McCarthyism.
And what is the theory that says that?
The theory.
The theory that says that once something is
Oh yeah, the domino effect. And so essentially, America was scared that once communism would spread to Vietnam and Southeast Asia and so on, and it would be an unstoppable spread, and all of Asia would adopt communism. All right. Thanks, Matthew.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for watching. See you guys next week when we talk about the civil rights movement. Thank you.